Welcome to Brain in a Vat. I'm delighted to have a very special episode today. I'm joined by Rebecca Tuvel. Jason is living it up in Thailand. And so I brought on one of our favorite guests. And we're going to be interviewing Chris Freiman. And we're going to be talking about why it's okay to ignore politics, which is also the title of Chris's book. And we've done a number of episodes from this wonderful series of why it's okay to. So have a look at the episode on slackers and eating meat and playing games. But Chris, would you like to start with a thought experiment?
Sure. Thanks for having me on. And, to clarify, the episode is special because Rebecca is co-hosting, not because I'm your guest. I feel like we gotta make that clear. So just here's sort of a simple thought experiment that I use to motivate my view occasionally. So suppose it's election day, and I don't know, you've been working, and the polls are going to close fairly soon, and so you get off work and you're driving to the polls because you're eager to do your civic duty and vote. But as you're driving to the polls, you stop at a stop sign. And while you're stopped, you can see some kids playing baseball. And you happen to notice that one of the kids gets hit in the eye with the ball. And so you stop, you go over, you take a look at the kid and say, oh, wow, this is really bad. This is a very serious eye injury. And it occurs to you that you have a choice to make. You can either take that kid to the hospital and, let's say, save their sight. And also we can say, suppose other people aren't around and so on, save their sight. Or you can leave the kid there and go vote. Now, it seems to me pretty clear that what you ought to do is save the kid's sight, even though it means that you'll lose the opportunity to vote, because by the time you're done with the emergency room visit, the polls will be closed, and so you won't be able to vote. Nevertheless, you shouldn't vote because the opportunity cost is very high in this case. It's the kid's sight. And so if you're on board with this conclusion that you should save the kid's sight rather than vote, I think you might be skeptical of a duty to vote in more sort of ordinary circumstances, sort of usual cases. So let's say it takes you a couple of hours to initially register to vote, do a minimal amount of research on the candidate, maybe try to debias. That's an important element of it too. We could talk about that maybe. And then actually maybe you have to wait in line and then you cast a vote. Let's say it takes 2 hours to do that whole thing. And actually, I think that's on the low side, but let's just say 2 hours. All right. If you work and earn the average American wage, which is about $25 an hour, if you had just worked 2 overtime hours at your job, you make about $50. And that $50, if you actually donated that to a particular charity, would be enough to save a kid's sight. So you say, okay, it turns out that even in ordinary circumstances, the opportunity cost of voting is a kid's sight. And so if you agree that saving a kid's sight is more morally important than casting a vote, and we could talk about this, but the vote won't actually make a difference to the outcome of the election. If you agree with that sort of value judgment, then what you should do instead of voting is take the time that you would have spent registering your vote or registering to vote, researching your vote, casting your vote. Don't do any of that. Spend that time working a couple extra hours at your job and then donate that extra income to effective charities.
Okay, so my first question is, let's assume that you present this argument to folks and they're convinced, of which, we have lots of reason to doubt that our arguments are convincing to people in such a way that motivates them to act differently, but we'll just assume that. But it turns out that they don't actually use the time that it would take them to vote. They just watch Netflix, or they just party, or they just, relax. Do you think that they still don't have an obligation to vote?
People generally aren't convinced by my arguments about voting, for better or for worse. But yeah, so I actually have a couple of thoughts on that. So one is I could say, look, I'm just giving you advice. And if you don't take it, that's on you. So if your doctor's like, I don't know, stop watching so much TV, get outside a little bit, cut down sugar, all that stuff. That's good advice. And if somebody just doesn't take it, or they use it as a rationalization to do something else that they just really wanted to do, it's like, that's on them. not on the doctor. They say, I'm just presenting arguments that you could take or leave. But maybe the sort of more interesting response is I actually think that might be okay. And so the thought is something like this: if you think your sort of well-being, it doesn't count for more than others, but it doesn't count for less than others as well. And you're like, I might get like a decent amount of satisfaction from like watching Netflix or, going out to lunch or seeing whatever. Like that's not bad. So like certainly the welfare gain from that is going to be higher than, whatever sort of good I can do with the vote, because the vote's not actually going to make a difference in the election. And so you could have this sort of thought experiment where it's like, well, suppose it's not you doing the fun thing. Suppose you're like, instead of voting, I'm going to take my friend out to lunch and they're going to have a blast. That actually seems to me pretty good. And so if you say, well, your well-being doesn't count for any less than your friend, so you're treating yourself on election day, I'm not scandalized by the thought that might actually be okay. Now, it would certainly be better if you spent that time earning to donate to an effective charity. But like I said, creating a nice day for somebody is sort of a good thing to do. And I think that's true even if it's yourself.
So I've got two objections. The way I understand your thought experiment is to try and establish a weight for how good it is to vote. And I think it's convincing in the case of the child, where most people say it's better to save the child's eye than to vote. And so you then make a separate move, which is say, well, you could do that through donations. And that will, of course, be persuasive to consequentialists or people that are persuaded by effective altruism, and we'll see that calculation quite neatly. I imagine that's one of the reasons why people might be unpersuaded, is that they think that voting is not just about the possibility of creating a good outcome. It's about being a certain kind of person. So they might think that a good person is one who is involved in the political process, and that renouncing the political process is a bad thing and should only be done under severe circumstances, like the case that you give of saving the child's eye, but are going to get uncomfortable in the case of the Netflix because they're not doing utility calculation. They think it reflects on your character. So are you being a bad person by failing to vote? One. And voting seems to be only one way in which one can be politically involved. But I'm willing to accept that it's a very inefficacious way. The chances of you ever changing the results of an election are vanishingly small. But there are other ways that you can be politically involved, that aren't just about a mere vote. So does being a good person require you to do that?
Right. So people do sort of like a virtuous person is politically involved. And I guess, so I'm not convinced by that. So you might say, I guess there's always to this question of like, what is the standard by which we judge whether somebody is virtuous? And I'm always sort of compelled, I'm very sympathetic to consequentialism. And so my very unsophisticated take on virtue is like, virtues are character traits that like produce good outcomes over time, something like that. But let's bracket that. I would say a virtuous person is somebody who does things to make the world a better place. And I would put in a pitch for effective altruism here. But I would say, even if you're not an effective altruist, even if you're not a consequentialist, that there's still this question about what would make political participation special. So suppose you have somebody who's like, look, I'm not politically active really in any sense. I don't vote. I don't follow the news or anything like that. But I volunteer at my local hospital. I'm a volunteer firefighter. Seems to me that is as good and almost certainly better than being politically active. And so then the question is, what is it that makes political participation special such that you are a bad person if you don't do it? But like, are you a bad person if you don't volunteer at a fire department? Probably not. Like, you don't have to do that in particular. You have to do something. But it doesn't have to be firefighting. It doesn't have to be politics. It doesn't have to be volunteering at the hospital. So this is something that Jason Brennan has written a bunch about too, which is just like, what is it that would make this special? So this might be one way of contributing to the common good, but it's not the only way. And so why is it that so many people think this is what we have to do? We have to be politically active, but we don't have to be active fighting fires or earning to give to the Against Malaria Foundation. And then as to your second question, yeah, I'm more sympathetic to this idea that we have strong moral reasons to engage in forms of, I don't know, political activism or something like that, when there's actually good reason to think that they'll be effective. But here again, for me, and I realize that this is sort of a contentious point, but really, it is about effectiveness, in my view. So this might not be exactly what you had in mind with the question, but sometimes people will say, look, what about local politics? So you're not going to change the winner of the presidential election in the US, but I don't know, maybe you can get a pothole filled or something like that. Like, you could have an influence on that. I think that's right. That is right. You have more of an impact on local politics, but also the payoff is pretty small. You say, all right, you're spending all that time and you're burning all those calories to get a pothole filled, which is well and good. But the opportunity cost of that, again, is you could have been working overtime and sending money to the Against Malaria Foundation. So I definitely think we have stronger moral reasons to participate in politics when there's reason to think it has an impact. But even there, we have to be mindful of what the opportunity cost is. And should we be doing other things that might actually be more impactful?
So I see the force of the kind of causal inefficacy objection that's embedded in your argument, or basically the idea that you don't have an obligation to do anything that's not going to causally contribute to bringing about the outcome that you hope for. And I wonder how your argument generalizes to other cases. Like, people will often say, well, you don't have an obligation not to eat meat because you don't make an individual difference. You don't have an obligation to recycle because you don't make an individual difference. You don't have an obligation to get vaccinated because your vaccine won't make an individual difference to like herd immunity or whatnot. It seems like this is just feature of all collective action problems, right? That any one individual is not going to make a difference. And so, and yet I think for a lot of people, it seems like we're missing something if we just conclude then that individuals don't have any obligations to do any of those things. Although my hunch is that you're about to just bite the bullet on all of that.
Yes. Yes, but. So I will bite the bullet. So again, let's just assume for the sake of argument. So like, I've read different things about the impact of like an individual's consumption of factory farm. Like, it might make a difference, but let's just set that aside. Let's just assume that it doesn't actually make a difference, one individual's consumption of factory farmed meat or recycling or anything like that. Then I'm going to bite the bullet. But I'm also going to give you an answer that everybody hates. I don't know why people hate this, but they do. I mean, I guess I know why they hate it. So here's what I say to do. Is so you say, okay, you're not really obligated to abstain from McDonald's, assuming it doesn't make a difference. But here's what you should do is donate money to effective animal welfare charities. You donate enough, and that actually will have an impact. And like I said, people don't like this. They think it's like buying your way out of a moral obligation or something like that. But I actually think that will have the best outcome for animal welfare. You just say, eat meat, that's not going to make a difference, but donate a lot to animal welfare charities. And the other thing too, right? So you say, this is just like all collective action problems. And then people, and this maybe like leads into another concern that people have with my argument, which is, well, what if everybody followed your advice? Cause it would be bad if everybody stopped recycling. And it would be very good if everybody stopped eating factory farmed meat. Like, I accept all that. And I guess my glib response is there is no chance of my arguments having that impact at all. If anything, people double down on voting because they dislike the argument so much. They're like going to commit voter fraud so they can vote twice just to spite me. But I'm like, I don't know. But so then they say, okay, well, like, what if you really were influential? And there like was a risk of people actually abstaining from voting or, stopping recycling, that sort of stuff. Oh, then yeah, maybe it would be irresponsible to tell people not to do these things. But realistically, I don't even know what a realistic number is. Like, suppose I convince like 10 people. I convince 10 people to say, you know what, I'm just tuning out, no more politics. but I actually am going to donate more money to the Against Malaria Foundation. That's not going to affect political outcomes at all, and it's going to save some people's lives. So that would be a win in my book if I convince 10 people in my life.
So there might be a concern with adding in the effectual altruism as the alternative to anything. So if on the other side of the scale is you can save a bunch of lives through this measure, well, there are many other things that one could say you should be not doing, instead of playing games or hanging out with your friends or whatever it is. And I'm sure there's some point where you think, well, you have an obligation to yourself to lead a life that's flourishing. Maybe that requires some level of, duty towards others, but there's a cap. But one way to assess the value of political participation is on its own terms. I think there's something to be said for working out its own price in comparison, when we would say it's not worth it in comparison to this thing. But it might be that it's entirely worthless and that we don't even need to put something on the other side of the scales. So, Rebecca's opening case of saying, look, if you just lie on the couch and watch Netflix or just take a nap or just ignore election day always and just do something banal, go to, the DMV and get your driver's license done, something not particularly fun. It's slightly more efficacious than the vote. At least you got a good night's sleep or whatever it is. The vote itself, your chances of participating, of affecting the outcome are vanishingly small. And furthermore, you might think that if in getting involved in politics is a good thing, some people think, well, I've done my bit. I voted, so I can now check out for 4 years. As opposed to someone who says, no, look, politics really matters. It matters if you live in a society where your government is really sinister. And if you can play a role in striking down racist laws, for example, that would generate a lot of good. And that's a project worth engaging in. So if you look at, let's say, civil rights activists in the States, they were involved in political action. Doesn't necessarily involve supporting a political party, but it's saying that there are a bunch of laws that are discriminatory and we are going to engage in action to have them removed. You might think, for example, encouraging people to fund strategic litigation that strikes down statutes that are unconstitutional is a good way to spend your time. So I think trying to get a bound of what counts as political activity, maybe having different prices for different things and saying, look, a vote's kind of worthless. It only matters if you're trying to get, hundreds of thousands or millions of people to vote. And so directing an effort to that thing might be useful because, Party A is going to scrap all the evil laws. If you can vote the Nazis out of power or stop the communists from coming in, that seems like a worthwhile endeavor. But if you are in the situation where you've got this very sinister political body in charge, directing your efforts to toppling them seems like a good thing.
Yeah. And so just on that note, I mean, I do think, the fixation on voting has really narrowed people's conception of what politics is. It's like, you vote, you get the sticker that said I voted, and you sort of do this kind of thing. And you're like, all right, I'll see you in 4 years. And that doesn't really, that doesn't, on an individual level, it doesn't really create change. And like you said, there are many other forms of political activism that have a higher chance of making a positive impact. And so, yeah, so I think we have much stronger reason to engage in those things than voting in particular. And on the point too about like, let's talk about voting on its own terms. Yeah, I think that's right. So, you could think of a couple of analogous cases to say, even if you're just, going to the DMV, it's probably more worthwhile. So if you say, like, there really is just no practical chance of you changing the winner of the presidential election. It just really is difficult for me to see how you could have a duty to vote. So in my book, I give a case like this. It would almost be analogous to saying you have a duty to walk to a wishing well and throw some coins in the wishing well and wish for world peace. It'd be like, well, why would anybody think you have a duty to do that? Because it actually has no chance of bringing about world peace. And so, swing states are maybe a complicated case where like maybe it's not exactly a trivial chance, but leaving that one aside, it's like voting is kind of throwing the coins in the wishing well and wishing for world peace. Why would you have to do that? It's not going to make a difference. So there again, you say, are you watching Netflix or are you, walking to the wishing well and throwing in the coins? You're like, I'm hanging out watching Netflix. Nobody's going to criticize you for that. But they will criticize you for not voting and watching Netflix, even though like the causal impact of the coin is basically the same as the causal impact of the vote.
Really curious to know like what you take to be like the most challenging objection you've actually received to this argument.
So I think the toughest one is that if you live in one of a handful of swing states, I forget exactly what the numbers are in which states they are, but it's like maybe Pennsylvania or something like that. There's like a 1 in 8 million chance that you could actually flip the winner. Like 1 in 8 million, not great, but the payoff is enormous if you can actually do that. And so, my initial response to that is to grant it and say, okay, look, if you live in one of these 5 or 6 states or whatever they are, maybe you have a duty to vote. But that probably isn't going to satisfy the people who think there's a universal duty to vote. So if I'm like, look, fine, if you're in Pennsylvania, you got to go vote. But if you're in California, stay home. Most people who are enthusiastic cheerleaders of voting be like, no, you got to vote even if you're in California. That's sort of the first point is, look, I'll even grant you all this stuff about the swing states. It's not going to get you what you want. Because I think a lot of advocates of the duty to vote, think of it like the duty to keep your promises. It would be weird if I was like, well, you have a duty to keep your promises in Pennsylvania, but not California. It would just be a bizarre way of thinking about promises. But if we really put a lot of weight on the swing state stuff, that's kind of what the duty to vote looked like. The other response, and I've sort of worked up a paper on this. I published a paper with, I mentioned Jay Brennan. We wrote something on this. And basically the challenge is that it becomes very difficult. So it's very good if you cast a vote in a swing state, you flip the election towards the better candidate. But it's a catastrophe if you flip it to the worst candidate. So you need to be pretty darn sure you know who the better candidate is. And I do think there are cases where you can be pretty sure you know who the worst candidate is. But I also think people have a tendency to be overconfident. And so there are lots of reasons to sort of cast doubt on our own ability to judge who's better. So one is just, you need a lot of information about a lot of stuff. So you don't just need to know about the candidates. You need to know stuff about economics, ecology, like all this sort of stuff. Most people don't know that. Even more so than that, you have to at least make a good faith effort to debias yourself. And nobody does that. Or very few people do that. So even if you have the information, but you process the information in a way that just tells you, hey, look, my party's always right. Maybe you should be self-skeptical in that case. And sort of like one final reason for being self-skeptical about our political judgment. So this is like maybe this might be my favorite paper in political philosophy from the last 10 years by Rishi Joshi. It's called, What Are the Chances You're Right About Everything? And what he points out is he's like, look at, where Democrats line up on, abortion, the death penalty, immigration, taxes, all this stuff, and look at where like Republicans line up on abortion, the death penalty, guns, et cetera, et cetera. These are issues that are like largely disconnected from one another. So like the beliefs that inform a person's view about abortion are very different from the beliefs that inform their view about like the efficacy of the minimum wage. They're just rationally orthogonal. But why is it that people who want a higher minimum wage almost always think that abortion is permissible? Like, that's weird. That's just weird that those two beliefs would go together. And like I think the plausible explanation for why they go together is just that's what one party happens to stand for. So if you're a Democrat, you believe in a higher minimum wage, and you believe in the permissibility of abortion, and you believe in the impermissibility of the death penalty. You could go on down the line, even though those are not really related to each other. And so his point is like, it'd be very weird if one party got this whole thing right. It would be even like the even weirder thing is if one party got everything wrong. So like, that's actually the real puzzle is like, if you're a Democrat, how is it that the Republicans are getting every single thing wrong or like all these big issues wrong? Like you need an explanation for that. And he goes through various explanations, and it's vice versa. It's like a bipartisan thing. So if you're a Republican, you also need a story about why Democrats get all of these disconnected issues completely wrong. And so like my own view is like, there's not really a genuine connection between these issues. Like you could try to find some sort of unifying thread. I just don't think it's there. And really the reason why Democrats think Democrats get it all right and Republicans get it all wrong is because they're just on Team Democrat. And this is just how political psychology works. We think our party is right and the other party's wrong. But now knowing this about yourself, you're like, oh, it's obvious that the candidate that my party always puts up is always the right one. You're like, nah, you gotta be more self-skeptical than that. I would say, okay, you're in a swing state. If you get it right, it's very good. You get it wrong, it's very bad. So you need to be very careful here. Well, what do you want to do? Do a lot of research, not just on the candidate, but on social science, all this other stuff. And then also try to debias yourself. And the other problem is we don't really have good debiasing techniques either. Like I've looked into this literature, it's like, it's not very promising. But if you go through all that, then I'll say, all right, go vote. But like that gets it like that's 4 people. We would have 4 voters, I think, in that scenario.
That's great. Thanks. Just wanted to follow up quickly on this because I'm wondering if maybe what people think sometimes when they say that you have a duty to vote or you have a duty to abstain from meat eating. I'm not saying that those are perfectly analogous, but just any kind of individual action that you might have good reason to think is causally inefficacious. If what they're really communicating is you should care about the political organization of your society, or you should care about the suffering of sentient beings, or something like that. And I think I'm wondering if the people who like abstain from voting, but then go and do all of this, these other things that are, likely to have a greater impact, either socially or politically. And the person who keep eating meat, maybe, but who donates to the effective altruist organization, like in favor of animal welfare. Like this is really a psychological question, but I suppose, like what if what people are saying is because of kind of cognitive dissonance, it's just going to be difficult for people to, continue to do the right thing, in the kind of collective sphere, but to not actually align their own individual behaviors with what they think ought to be at the collective level. So maybe it's more so that the people are saying like, well, it's going to be harder for you to actually be politically efficacious or care about politics or care about animal welfare or whatever if you're also not kind of aligning internally.
Yeah, that's interesting. So the idea would be something like you're going to run out of steam on the donations to the animal welfare charities if you're going to McDonald's every day. So what I would say is if it does turn out that that's sort of just the case psychologically, then I would say, okay, then that is a good reason to say like, look, you're not going to be able to stay motivated to do the efficacious thing if you don't actually do the inefficacious thing. That's a really interesting question. Because I could see that being the case. I do wonder though, but I also think it could also sort of run in the opposite direction. So there's I'm a little bit familiar with this literature, although not very familiar with it, so take it with a grain of salt. But there's like the moral licensing stuff where, and we sort of alluded to this earlier. I forget what exactly the examples are, but one of the studies was something like, I don't know, like people who like wrote an essay defending the environment were like less likely to recycle, something like that. Take that with a grain of salt. But that was like the sort of upshot, which is people like, well, I did this good thing or good seeming thing, and now I have this permission to do something bad. And so I do or maybe not do something good, another thing. And so I do wonder, like, maybe it would work the other way where somebody's like, I voted, I got my sticker that says I voted, and now like I'm good. When somebody comes collecting for the Against Malaria Foundation, no, I can say I've already done my good deed. And so like it's going to be an empirical question how that shakes out. But yeah, so to answer the question more directly, I would say if that does turn out to be the case, then I would say, yeah. So then it would be like sort of indirectly efficacious, which I'm fine with. But I would say too, like, as long as I'm putting in a plug for effective altruism, like one of the nice things about that is it's like, it really is like just set it and forget it. It's like you just say, all right, every month against Malaria Foundation. It's like, taxes. It just disappears. You don't even have to, it's easier than taxes, right? Much easier than taxes. And just say like, there's no sort of cognitive or emotional burden once you say, all right, I'm donating 10% of my income to an effective charity. So I think that takes like pretty minimal willpower to get going.
So I'm going to try and give you a hard case where we've got something that's causally inefficacious, but I don't think we're going to say it's okay to participate. So imagine someone has a Kickstarter campaign. They say, I've found a whole bunch of children being raped and murdered and then raped afterwards again. And I've got all this footage and I'm crowdfunding to make a DVD special. Now, don't worry, the kids are already dead. We're not going to kill any new kids. We're just going to package this product. So you'll just consume the product. And it will have no effect whatsoever on any future child. In fact, it might even have a positive effect in that if you had the desire to go out and rape and murder a child, you can watch this DVD instead. And so you're thinking, should I go and contribute to the Kickstarter and go and buy one of these DVDs? And, you say, is it okay? You might say, look, it's not a lot of people's taste. Very few people want to watch a movie like this. I get that. But is it permissible?
Yeah, so that's a hard case. I mean, so one initial response I would have, and I think this is actually sort of the heart of my response to that sort of case is, and now I'm going back to this kind of virtue ethical perspective, is like, what kind of person looks at that and is like, I have a finite amount of money and I am allocating some of my finite resources to this like grotesque moral catastrophe. Like you can't be a good, like, I just don't think you could be a good person and want to allocate money to, so you're like, I could do all these things with my, like, even forget the Against Malaria Foundation. You could go out to the movie, like regular movies, go to the museum and you're like, no, I don't want to give money to the museum. I want to give it to this project. Like that's just like a morally debased character. Yeah. But so like the act itself, so I think the other thing too is in these sorts of cases, like, so there's all this interesting evidence about like how disgust and moral outrage and things like that interact. And so I think like we find like this is just such a disgusting and morally outrageous act that like there's no way to sort of convince ourselves that it could be permissible, even if we just stipulate that there's no causal impact. But I would say like if to sort of ramp up the example, if you're like, God tells me there is no causal impact. So like, I'm not taking some Kickstarter guys where God says there's no causal impact. No one's going to be harmed. We're talking like second order effects, blah, 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 nothing. So the question would be for me, what would make it impermissible? I think the best answer for why it would be impermissible is something like the virtue ethical explanation, where it's just like no person of decent character could do that. And I agree, no person of decent character could possibly do that. But yeah, I guess I have a hard time saying if God tells me zero negative causal impact, then it's like, yeah, hard to see where it would be impermissible. I don't know. Is that compelling or is that a deal breaker that my view boxes me into that?
So I think that's interesting. The idea is that if you bite the bullet and you go, look, if it doesn't have an impact, the only worry you have is you paid too much for the DVD and you could have spent that money like saving kids from malaria. And I go, don't worry, it was a nickel. You go, okay, well, yes, that's fine. No problem. But you point at the objection, which is people want to say by participating in this project, by being involved somehow, you've done something really wrong. And that's what the kind of people who say, well, look, eating the steak isn't going to make a difference one way or the other for saving a cow. I'm not going to be able to tip the scales to get the grocery stores to order less or the restaurant to order less. But I'm endorsing a sinister thing, the terrible conditions in the factory farm. And I think the inverse of that on voting is to say, well, there are all these people who fought and died for the right to vote. And your refusal to participate in this really good thing is morally repugnant and reflects poorly on your character. And so that's the flip side of the coin, is to say, well, there are certain activities that we think are really important to engage in, and that's where the obligation kicks in, just in the way that you have an obligation not to contribute towards the Kickstarter DVD. Of course, if you bite the bullet, then you've just narrowed the field for people that will find your view acceptable. They're going to say, well, there's more to morality than causal impact. They're going to say that there are these other things that seem to play a role for us. And then if you're only persuasive to utilitarians, that's a defect in the view.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. So let me try to say a little bit more. So, right. So most people aren't willing to bite the bullet. People are too averse to bullet biting, frankly. People should be biting more bullets. But one thing you could say to soften the blow, and I actually don't think I believe this, but if I'm in the business of trying to market my view, is you could say that there is an asymmetry between positive duties to do causally and efficacious stuff and negative duties to abstain. So you could say, again, God tells you your Big Mac doesn't make a difference. God tells you this Kickstarter contribution is not going to make a difference. You might say you still have a duty to abstain for whatever sort of reason you want to give. Like, again, maybe it's like this expressive stuff, maybe it's this virtue stuff. But you could say that, like, it doesn't follow from that you have a positive duty to do things that are causally inefficacious. So then it's like, well, why isn't there a positive duty to throw the coins in the wishing well? It's like, because it's not going to make a difference. And like, plausibly, it's not like a stain on your character that you refuse to throw coins in the wishing well, in the way that it does seem like a stain on your character to contribute to the Kickstarter. I mean, something else too, to like rewind a little bit, is like, so like, if people play a violent video game, or they watch a violent movie, or like they watch like some really, this is just like a regular movie or like a regular video game. It's not the Kickstarter game. It's like, is that morally, like, is it morally bad to like kill a video game character? Like even torture a video game character? I think you might say, look, what kind of person wants to torture a video game character? Like that's a sick person. But what about the act itself? Is the act itself of torturing a video game character impermissible? I'm inclined to say no, because it doesn't actually harm anyone. And so you say, all right, there's no moral duty not to torture video game characters, even though you'd have to be a pretty sick puppy to want to do it. Say, all right, well, clearly you're a sick puppy if you're donating to this Kickstarter. But if there's no harm, again, like, you got to come up with a positive story about why it's impermissible. And again, maybe there is one. But I think there are ways to soften the blow even further.
I want to pick up on like one variation of the thought experiment, Mark, which is when you said not only may you have reason to think it's not going to cause any harm, but you actually might have reason to think that this is going to bring about some good. Namely, people are going to watch this video and then not go out in the world and rape and murder kids. Is that not one of the elements? And so in that case, it looks like what might generally be a duty not to be like a kind of sicko who's buying or contributing to this Kickstarter comes into conflict with the consequentialist intuition, because your response should be, you're not a sick person. You're not, because you're doing the thing that's actually going to bring about some good, or you think it's likely to. So
yeah, well, I would need to see the spreadsheets telling me that does more good than a donation to the Against Malaria Foundation. But so I will say, like, no, so maybe my intuition pump is broken about some of this like complicity and injustice stuff. So what is like the Bernard Williams case about like you could like work for a chemical weapons department or something like that, but like sabotage it from the inside. It's sort of like that. So it's like you have to get your hands dirty, and like you have to be complicit in this injustice. But by doing that, you can actually like prevent a lot of suffering, something like that. I confess, like I I didn't ever really see the force of the idea that you have to keep your hands clean, even though it means needless suffering. So like other sorts of cases where it's like, Stalin says, I'll put you in charge of this gulag. And if you don't take the job, there's going to be a very enthusiastic Stalinist who takes the job. And if you take the job, you can let every 10th person go. It always struck me as pretty clear that you should take that job. I don't know, is that crazy? People seem to think it's crazy, but it always struck me as correct. I don't know.
That's very interesting. I mean, I think that bites the maximizing bullet in quite a big way. The deontologist says you have no duty to be complicit in moral wrongs. And your idea is, well, I do have a duty to maximize the good and reduce suffering. And this is an opportunity to do just that. It ties into something I've been thinking about and discussing with friends, which is it might be that some politicians do some things that we think are dastardly and we don't like their methods. But overall, they do things that we think are very good. They wind up overall net improving the lives of many people. Now, as you pointed out, your vote doesn't really matter one way or the other on that, but you could dedicate, let's say, a fair amount of effort to ensuring that politician, came into power. Assume that you're very wealthy. Assume that you actually have the ability to change electoral outcomes. And you look at someone who, has a proven track record. You say, look, they do dastardly stuff, but overall, it's going to be quite good, and it's worth us pooling our money together to ensure that this guy gets elected. And clearly, that's what you find in American politics, right? Is that very wealthy people spend their money to try and drive campaigns, to form a super PAC, to get their guy elected. And as you point out, maybe we're not very good at working out whether they really will do it, and we're not experts. But you might think that if you've got a large number of people who form the PAC, that they've got a variety of intelligent minds out there, that the group is got some level of wisdom in it, that doing that is a good idea. So there's sort of two elements in it. There's the one of you're doing something actually efficacious, and the other one is you're supporting a candidate who's got dirty hands.
So I'm open to that. So I mean, I guess it would depend on how dastardly the dastardly deeds are. But yeah, I mean, in terms of the general point, like I don't. So let me preface this by saying I think I can get everything I need to argue that there's no duty to vote or be politically active without saying what I'm about to say. Like, I don't think you have to be a full-fledged consequentialist. I think you just have to be persuaded about like no positive duty to do causally and efficacious stuff. But so like, let's bracket that. So again, if I can convince I don't want to dissuade people. I don't want to encourage people to vote because they don't like what I'm about to say. But like, I don't have a problem with somebody saying like, look, the comparison between the two presidential candidates, this one will be much better for the country than the other. And so I'm going to put tens of millions of dollars behind their campaign. That's totally fine. I think one reason I think that's fine is because like, no, you don't get to that level of political power with having clean hands. Like, it's just not. So like, if you are a person who's very careful about keeping your hands clean, I know I said that I sound like an edgy teenager when I say this, but it's like, you're not going to rise through the political ranks if you're that concerned about it, either because you drop out or at some point you get your hands dirty. And I'm not even talking about like sinister stuff. I'm just like, you have to like placate special interests and do these sorts of things to get elected. But like, I can understand why people aren't persuaded by my argument, because there would be like trade-offs between maybe fairness and welfare. So people are like, oh, it's just unfair that billionaires have more of an impact over the election than random people. That's fine. I'm sort of less concerned about that than most people are. And so, like I said, if you don't like my endorsement of somebody putting $10 million behind the better candidate, that's okay. You still shouldn't vote. But I'm not scandalized by that. And actually, like, I do kind of think here again, setting aside the self-skepticism, like if you were super rich, like if this person gets into office, they're going to make like 300 million people's lives better. Let's say, yeah, all right, put $10 million there. Like, and even if it is unfair, at a certain point, welfare is going to outweigh fairness anyway, even if you're not a full-on consequentialist.
how responsible do you think people need to be when it comes to being effective altruists, right? So obviously there are all these organizations out there devoted to figuring out what charities are actually efficacious, right? Like the Against Malaria Foundation and others maybe that you can tell us about. But there's obviously got to be a great deal of trust involved in order for you to kind of just be like, I know that this is coming out of my bank account every month, and I'm just going to sort of forget about it. So what are the duties there?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say, just as an initial point, as a comparative point, I have more trust in these charities than the politicians I might vote for. So that's the thing. Like, not that this is your objection, but like sometimes when I talk about this, like when I give my effective altruism spiel, people are like, "Oh, like how do you know like the money is going where they say it's going?" All this sort of stuff. It was like, have you listened to politicians' campaign promises and then what they actually do? Like, comparatively speaking, it's like the charities are immaculate. But yeah, so I think you do have a duty to do some research. But I mean, I think there's enough verification of at least some of these major charities that, as philosophers, we're not even certain that we have hands. So like, you can't be 100% certain of anything. But I think like in terms of like the charities that like distribute cash directly to people in poverty or anti-malarial bed nets and stuff like this, like they do have very good track records. There's a lot of evidence that they do what they say they do and that they actually have the positive impact that they say that they have. And so you say, all right, even if it falls short of complete certainty, it's like you can be certain enough to modify your behavior. But I agree, like you don't just want to say, I'm going to give to any charity that sounds good. I mean, so my personal favorite is, so I go to givewell.org, and then they changed the name of the thing I do. It used to be called like the Maximum Impact Fund, and now they call it something different, but it's the same sort of deal. But they're basically like, look, give us the money and we'll allocate it in the maximally beneficial ways. They say, all right, there you go. I just write that off. Like every month it disappears into the ether. Well, hopefully not disappears into the ether, but it goes into their hands so that they can do good work. But it actually is not a tremendous amount of work to do to vet some of these charities.
So I think it's interesting to think about the parallel cases of governments that claim that they're going to do good and charities that claim they're going to do good. And effective altruism as a movement has come under a lot of scrutiny, sometimes for bad reasons. Some people like Sam Bankman-Fried, touted the movement, and because it turns out that he's a fraudster doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with the movement necessarily. But what has come out is that some of the projects that they thought were very efficacious aren't. And you mentioned one, which is malaria nets. So this was seen as a very good way to save a lot of lives. It turns out that in practice, people don't use the nets to stop malaria. They use them to go and fish, and they get sick because the nets have chemicals in them. If you look at the price that was sort of assumed that you could save a life for, that number has gone up quite dramatically over time, which shows that those who were doing the estimates weren't very good at it. And this harmonizes with the views that you have in your book about how difficult it is to find out what's true in the world, that politicians are pretty bad at finding out what policies are going to actually work. We don't think about second order effects, that we have incredibly complex systems. And it might just be that a lot of interventions are going to have very bad effects. So another good example, the Red Cross would assist people who are involved in conflicts, and in order to operate, they couldn't decide, who gets treatment. They just said, if you're injured, come in and we'll treat you. And so what you had in Sudan was Janjaweed people coming in who had been, shot, but were engaged in like very violent behavior. They get sewed up by the Red Cross, and they would go out and they would kill more people. And so the good of providing medical aid to anyone who needs it turns out to have a lot of bad second order effects for innocent civilians. And so it might very well be that if you accept your arguments about don't get involved in politics, it's a messy game where no one knows what the hell they're doing. It's incredibly complicated. Even the experts don't know what the hell they're talking about. Similarly, you might think that a lot of charity really is that as well, that you've got a lot of good-hearted people who want to do good and they just fuck it up over and over and over again. Just lead a good life on your own. Like, focus on yourself. Try and ensure that you and your family are having a good time. If everybody else did that, we'd have a much more prosperous place. the mistakes happen when you try to start going beyond your immediate circumstances, where it's not very easy for you to find out what's actually going to be efficacious.
I'm pretty sympathetic to this. You do a good job with your own life and your family and at work. That's 98% of it. That would take care of a lot of problems, I think. But just a couple of quick thoughts. So I agree with the spirit of the objection that charity is very complicated. I do think, just as a comparative point, it's less complicated than politics, just because here again, if we're talking about voting in a presidential election, you got to know what this person's going to do with abortion, the death penalty, immigration, minimum wage. It's just much, much more complicated. And so even if we're talking about comparatively, how should I allocate my time or my philanthropic resources, I still think charity is going to have an edge here. But also, one virtue of effective altruism, or at least sort of effective altruism in its ideal form, is that we should be sensitive to feedback. So you're this thing didn't work, and let's learn from this and try to do better the next time. And I think that's all we can ask of people in their roles as altruists, is they do the best they can, and when they get counter evidence, they update their beliefs. And so, it could be the case that even that is we just have no idea. I don't know. I think we know enough in some cases. So even if you don't like the malaria nets, Give Directly, for example, which is you're literally just giving cash to people in severe poverty. And look, there are clearly ways in which that can go wrong as well. But if you say, look, I'm making a bet, will that $100 do more good in my pocket or that person's pocket? I think it is still rational to bet that it's going to do more good in that person's pocket. And so if you say you do have some duty to make the world a better place beyond just your family and your workplace and so on, I say all you can ask people to do is make the best bets that they can. And the best bets that we have are these effective altruist ones. And maybe even, this is even a whole other thing, which is now people have me worried that I should be donating all. So I just autobiographically, I split my donation between GiveWell, which helps humans, and these animal welfare charities, like we were talking about. But now I'm worried, we got to give it all to animal welfare charities, because the bang for the buck for those is so much greater, people are telling me, but even them. But I would say, look, that could be right. Maybe I'm giving to the wrong charities, or my allocation is wrong. But I'd say you gotta do something to make the world a better place. And you should do something that actually looks like it's going to have a positive impact. And you do your research, and then you make a calculated bet. And if you go wrong, then that's just part of being a human being. But yeah, the broader point is very well taken, which is the world is very, very complicated, probably much more complicated than most philosophers want to admit. And so you just, do the best you can and sort of make peace with that kind of uncertainty.
Just to follow up on this, so I know that some effective altruists are sympathetic to long-termism, or the idea that the main way, or one of the main ways that we should be doing good, is not thinking so much about our current generation of people, but future generations, because they're going to be more people, and we could, have a greater impact, maybe if we think in those terms. I imagine that some of the objections or worries that Mark brought up about how well we can predict apply to long-termism as well, although it looks like the worries about speculation and prediction are just kind of endemic to this approach more broadly. So do you have thoughts on long-termism, and are you sympathetic?
Yeah, I am, although, the uncertainty point really hurts there. So, there are also these moral complications too, about the non-identity problem. So all of my philanthropic energy does not, it goes to GiveWell and the animal charities and stuff. I don't do any long-termist stuff for a variety of reasons. But the basic idea that there's going to be tons and tons of future people potentially, and we can have a big impact on their welfare, and so we should take that seriously. I buy that. I think it's hard to know what we should do. I don't know. some of the AI stuff, I wasn't worried about the AI stuff a couple of years ago. I'm starting to worry about it now. I mean, one of the interesting things about like this long-termist stuff is once you start playing around with these huge numbers, it becomes really hard to know what to do. So suppose you're like, there's a 10% chance in the next 20 years, I'm just making this up, but the 10% chance in the next 20 years, AI is going to like destroy all sentient life. And like that's a big problem. And even if there's only a 10% chance, we should be spending trillions of dollars on that. Like that strikes me as actually like not an unreasonable claim to make. So I'm glad that people are thinking about that. I might be a bit of a doomer, as the kids say, because absent worldwide coordination on like an AI pause or ban, I don't know how to stop it. But then also too, it's like weird. I'm getting outside of my area here, but like, do you know Pascal's mugger? Have you heard of this case? I forget who came up with this case, but it's like kind of interesting. Where it's like, and I'm butchering the details, I'm sure, but it's like you're walking down the street and someone's like, "Give me $1, and if you give me the $1, I'll come back tomorrow at the same spot and give you $10 billion." And you're like, what are the odds this guy's going to come back with $10 billion tomorrow? Well, like you make that number high enough, and you're like, it might be rational to bet that you only have to give up $1. And so you should give Pascal's mugger the $1 because like, the expected payoff is actually high enough because the number is so huge. But like, that just doesn't, there's something weird about that. Like you just shouldn't give the guy the $1. It just seems weird. And so I sort of, start imploding when we're talking about like trillions of lives lost or like potential lives lost, that sort of thing. But yeah, I actually do think, I think we got to worry about the AI stuff because 10% doesn't actually strike me as a crazy number. When it comes to worrying about like the alignment problem and some of this AI stuff. But like I said, I don't know what to do. Like certainly there is nothing I can do about it. Maybe the UN or something can do something about it, but all you can do is pretend it's not happening, so that you can maintain a semblance of sanity for the rest of what may be our short lives. I don't know. Like I'm only half kidding. Like I don't know how to cope with it. I just don't think about it.
So the title of Chris's book really should be not just Ignore Politics, but Ignore Everything. You'll lead a much happier life. Chris, it was absolutely wonderful having you on the show.
Thank you. It's been great being here. Thank you.